Welcome to JonGetsGames. Today I'll be reviewing Yokohama. This is a spatial worker placement game designed by Hisashi Hayashi, and it's set in late 1800s Japan. Players take on the role of merchants who are trying to fulfill orders for and grab technologies from foreign countries, and they're going to get points for doing pretty much everything in this game. First, I'll explain how the game plays, and then I'll jump into my review. Before I begin explaining how the game is played, I do want to mention that this is the deluxe Kickstarter version of the game that I backed, so some of the components and pieces will be different from this to the retail version. Also, if you would prefer to learn the game by watching a full playthrough, you can do so by clicking up in the top corner to see the one that I did. Here we have Yokohama fully set up for a two-player game. You'll see this pyramid of action spaces down here. It has been shuffled up and randomly placed, and then we have randomly put these cards on top as well as these little bonus chits. And if we were playing a three-player game, we would add all these extra action spaces, and in a four-player game, we would add 4 more just like this to create a much bigger playing area. Let's now look at a player's personal area. They all have this warehouse board which has extra assistants, shops, and trading houses on them that they are not allowed to touch, and everything that is not on this tile is considered to be in their hand. So that means they start the game with 8 assistants, 2 shops, 1 of each of the main resources, 3 yen for the start player, and then they also get 2 of these order cards, and they're going to pick 1 of these 2 and discard the other one to the box. Each player's turn is split up into an A, B, and C phase, but I'm going to talk about the B main action phase first. The first part of the main action phase involves putting assistants down onto the board. Now, the player can either put 2 assistants down into one single spot, or they can put 3 assistants down, but they have to go into different spots out on the board, and it is nice because they don't have to be necessarily adjacent to each other. Now, once they have placed their assistants out, they're going to take their president, which currently at the beginning of the game is not on the board, and they'll place it down onto one of the locations that have one of their assistants. If it was not their first turn, however, and their president was already out on the board, then they would move their president from their current location to a new one, but they would have to follow a path of locations that have at least 1 assistant of their color. So, for instance, if they were to have this right here, and on their turn they started with their president over here, they would be able to move here and then all the way over here, jumping over this copper mine. It's also worth noting that if there had been an opponent's president on this copper mine when they decided to do the placement phase, then they would have had to pay 1 money when they actually put the assistant down into that spot. They could then put this over here, and you are allowed to move your president through locations that have opposing presidents, but you'll again have to pay 1 money to that president. So instead of the yellow player doing this, maybe instead they would take this assistant, put it up here into the silk mill, and then follow this path instead, so they did not passing through this red player. You're never allowed to end your president on a location that has the president of another player, but as I mentioned, you can pass through, you just have to pay the 1 money penalty. Once the president is done moving, the player will activate that location. They will add up the number of pieces of their color on that spot. In this case, it would be 1, 2, 3, and they look to the bottom and find that spot and take the reward. So in this case, they would get 1 copper from this copper mine for having this 3 evaluation. That also means they would get nothing if instead they had only had 1 assistant on that spot. Let's pretend, however, that the yellow player actually had 3 assistants down, so they would now have 4 on the activation. They would get 2 of these copper from the supply, but also you'll notice that the 4 is red and the 1, 2, and 3 are black. Once you get to the 4 or the 5 level, this allows the player to be able to construct a building down onto this card. When they do this, they simply grab one of the buildings that are currently in their hand, and at the beginning of the game, you have 2 shops and none of these trading houses, and then you will put it down onto this card. So if you're doing a shop, it'll go down onto one of these 4 spots on the left-hand side of the card, and you'll take the bonus that is associated. So if they went here, they would simply take 4 points, but if they went here instead, they would get 2 money from the bank. It's worth noting that in the future, if they were to come back to this spot, this shop is now 1 piece of their color, so they'll be able to evaluate higher up on here or be able to do the same level with less assistance. It's worth noting that a player is not allowed to have more than 1 shop on any given action space, and of course when opponents go down onto spots, it will block that bonus for other players. You also may have noticed this different silhouette on the far right. This is where players can put trading houses down once they pull them off their warehouse. Now, only 1 trading house at all can be put on each one, and a player is allowed to have a trading house and a shop on that spot, which makes it even better for them to activate this because it's another piece of their color, and in the future, if any opposing player activates a spot with a player's trading house, then that player who owns the trading house will get 1 yen from the bank when an opposing player activates the spot. Lastly, it's worth noting that if a player is able to get to a 5 evaluation and there's one of these tokens still on the board, then as a bonus, they are going to get to take this and bring it into their area. This one right here will give the player an import, while others might give things like money or resources like this tea and copper. Once players have in order evaluated the action on the area, then the 5 power bonus and potentially building, they will then recover all of the assistance on the spot that was just activated back into their hand. When we take a step back and look at all of the different actions, you'll see that many of them behave just like this copper mine. This fishery right here, this silk plantation, the bank gets you money, and this tea plantation, all of these things are just going to get you a certain number of that good when you activate it. Next up, when we look at this employment agency, you'll notice that it's going to get you a certain number of these icons which show a warehouse, a red arrow, and a number. If you look at the player board, you'll see it matches this icon on the warehouse, and this is the way you pull things off of your warehouse and put them into your hand. You'll notice that assistants are a free action to pull into your hand. It just consumes 1 warehouse action. In order to pull one of these shops into your hand, it'll cost 2 yen, and in order to grab these trading houses, it costs an increasing amount of yen each time. And while the employment agency is the main way to get these warehouse actions, you'll also notice that that icon can show up on orders that could be in your hand, as well as bonus locations for putting shops down. Next up, we have the port, which is where players will go to grab new orders to bring into their hand. You're never allowed to have more than 3 orders in your hand at a time, and it's worth noting that in a 3 and 4 player game, there will also be a dock, which looks just like the port, and it is going to be associated with a different row of cards that the orders will be down on. So if a player wants to grab this order, they would have to go to the port in order to grab it, because it's the port management board versus the dock and the dock management board down here. Now, if you look at the activations, we have low, medium, and high activations. This just shows you what part of the management board you're actually able to grab these orders from, and you're always allowed to spend 2 extra money or an import to grab 2 orders instead of 1 with an activation. Now we have the customs location and the church, and they behave very similarly. With the customs, you will be able to get rid of a certain number of these imports from your hand, and when you do so, you're going to take one of your assistants and put it down onto a spot that is associated with the number of imports you just got rid of. This might get you points, money, it also might get you warehouse actions, and at the end of the game, you will get 8 points if you have the most figures on this board, and 4 points if you have the second most. And with the church, the activating value you put on here is going to give you a faith value. You can add to that value by discarding resources, but no more than 1 of each of these resources, and then you're going to take an assistant, put it down on the spot that matches the faith value you just got. You'll get some points, and you'll get some of these assistant placement actions. This bonus, which can also show up in places like orders and shop bonuses right here, allow you to take assistants from your hand and put them down onto spots on the board with the added bonus where you can put them down into a location with an opposing president and not pay any penalty to that player. Now we have the laboratory, and you'll notice that when you activate it, you're going to get a certain number of gears, and these are associated with the technologies on this laboratory management board. So if you were to do a 3 activation, you would have 3 gears available, and you could potentially take this or this from the board, but you'll notice this one right here is 3 plus 1, so it's a little more expensive. Players are always allowed to spend 2 money or 1 import as many times as they want to add gears to this overall level, and as a global rule, you're never allowed to do an activation that is greater than 5. Any excess is wasted, so you would have to spend money or imports to get a gear level that is more than 5, and as you can see, some of these are really quite expensive, like the telephone over here, which is 6 plus 2 right at the moment. Much like the port and the dock, when you play in a 4-player game, the research center will also pop out with its own row of technologies that you can only grab by activating the research center location, but it's functionally identical to the laboratory. These technologies will add new incentives as well as bend some rules for the players. For instance, this one right here gives them 2 extra points whenever they build a shop down, and this one over here says that you're actually allowed to place your president on a spot occupied by another player, which normally you're not allowed to do. Finally, there are 2 more locations that only show up in the 3 or 4-player game. The first is the canal, which is just a penalty to walk across, and the other one is Chinatown, which lets you do a certain number of trades of resources back and forth for money, and this is also a way that you can purchase imports, but you're not allowed to sell them. At this point, I've explained everything to do with the main action phase, so if you notice the A and C phase just say additional action phase. You can take as many additional actions as you want before or after the main action, and the main additional action you're probably going to do is just cashing in these orders. So for instance, this one would require the player to have 1 fish, 1 tea, and 2 copper, and in this case, they would actually have that, so they would get rid of all of these things. They would get the bonus, in this case, that would be 4 victory points. They would also get 2 of those assistant placement actions, which I explained earlier, and you'll notice that there is this British flag in the top left corner. These flags will not only be worth some victory points at the end of the game, but in the middle of the game, every time you get a pair of the same flag, you will gather 1 foreign agent of that specific type as long as there are still some left, and these are another thing that you can spend as an additional action.
You can flip them over once per game and once per turn, and then evaluate most of a main action out on the board. You would skip the placement and movement phase. You would find one spot on the board that has at least one of your assistants and does not have your president, and then you could activate it. So that means using this token, the yellow player could actually pull these 2 yellow off, do a 2 value activation on the employment agency even though there's an opposing president there, and get that 1 effect. The third and final additional action option is achieving one of these public goals. Now you'll see this one right here just says the first person to have 7 fish, you don't have to spend it, will be able to take one of their assistants, put it down on here, and they will get 8 points. Anyone else behind them will just get 6 points. Over here, this would be the first person to 5 completed orders, will get 9, and then 7 for everybody else. And this one is showing certain locations out on the board with these buildings that are down on them. You'll notice some of them have this commerce symbol, and some of them have this production symbol. These are randomly put out at the beginning of each game. There are several each for these 3 public goals. Once a player is done with their turn, it goes to the next player in clockwise order, and players will continue taking turns until one of 5 endgame conditions are met. The first is one player gets all of their trading houses down. The second is one player gets all of their shops down. The third is there's a certain number of assistants on the customs board. The fourth is a certain number of assistants on the church board. And the fifth and final one is if you don't have enough orders to fill the management board. Once one of these 5 conditions are met, player will continue until we get back to the starting player, which is marked by this purple ship, and then everybody gets 1 more turn. After that, they then go into final scoring. At the bottom of each player's warehouse board, you'll see everything they get points for at the end of the game. First of all, there are the majorities for the assistants on the church and customs track. Also, the player with the most gears in all of their technology is going to get 10 points, and second most will get 5. And then the players will get points for having a variety of different flags. For each set of 5 that they have that are different, they'll get 12 points, and they will continue up with the various sets. So they will likely have multiple scoring conditions, like if they had 4 different flags, they get 8, and then another set of 3, they get 4, and that would add up to 12, or just having 5 will get 12. And lastly, they will get 1 point for having 2 money, unused foreign agents, unused imports, and 1 point for every 3 goods they have at the end. Once players have finished endgame scoring, they'll look to see who has the most points, and that person is the winner.
Let's now begin the review for Yokohama by covering a few positive points. And the first of these relates to probably my favorite aspect to the entire game, and that is the process of figuring out where to put my assistants down onto the map. There is both short-term tactical as well as long-term strategic thinking here, because when you put them down, you could put 2 onto 1 spot or 3 onto 3 separate locations. And it seems like when you do 2 down onto 1 location, more often than not, that's going to be the spot that you move your president to, because that kind of lets you jump over a threshold. It lets you get to the 4 or 5 value activations, which will let you put buildings down. And if you get to 5, you can grab that token if you're the first one to go to that spot. And these are really important things, but they don't help you out strategically, because when you send your president to a location and activate it, you're going to pull all those assistants back into your hand, and you have not helped your position on the board long term. But if you're putting 3 assistants down, more often than not, you don't actually need to put all 3 of those assistants to activate a plan that you have for your president on this turn. Maybe you need only 1 or 2, and then you have 1 or 2 assistants remaining to put out on the board for a future plan that you maybe haven't even got to yet. So you might say, well, I have this 1 assistant, maybe I'll put them down into the copper mine, because you need lots of assistants over there in order to do activations, because I think you need at least 3 stuff on that spot just to get 1 copper. Well, I'll put that assistant over there, and at some point in the future, I'm sure I'm going to want copper, and I'll be happy that past John put that assistant down there. And I love that kind of thinking, because you're really planning towards this turn right now, because you have to move your president, but you also need to think about the future and setting yourself up for good activations then. Another really good spot is to put it down on those technology locations, because you want lots of assistance and activation there to get lots of gears, so you can get the big, powerful technologies that I'm going to talk about later on in this review. So I just love the decisions that come into play with figuring out, am I going to put 2 down or 3? In general, it feels like putting 3 is better, because, more is better. It's a bigger number. But you also have to manage the economy of your assistants. If you run out of them, then you might find yourself in a little bit of a lull, like going to a spot and activating it, pulling 1 back, and the next turn putting 1 out, and really needing to get to those warehouse spots to grab more assistants off of your board and put them into your hand. You start the game with 8 of these assistants, but as you play, if you think too strategically, you will put too many of them out on the board, seeding all these future locations, and not be able to do anything right now, which you definitely need to do. Also, there are spots on the board where you will permanently lose your assistants to get various bonuses, so it's something you definitely need to keep your eye on. So yeah, I just love this assistant placement and assistant economy mechanic that is in this game. It's just a really wonderful thing to think about. For positive number 2, let's discuss the abundance of bonuses that exist in the game and how you can link these together to pull off some really satisfying combos. Now, by bonuses, I'm referring to the extra warehouse actions, resources, money, and assistant placement actions that can be associated with the orders that you're going to be fulfilling, as well as the bonuses for putting shops down on the board, and the customs track and the church track. There are just so many different ways to pull off tiny little bonuses, and there are many times where you are just one money shy or one silk shy away from pulling off several different things that you want to do, and it is very satisfying using these different things to get you there. Because if you just need one money, you don't want to spend your entire turn going to the bank and getting like 3 or 4 money when you only need one to do that other thing. Maybe you instead pull off an order that is in front of you that you have in your hand, and you get rid of those resources, and it's going to give you 1 money and maybe a couple victory points, and now you have that 1 money, and you can go over to another spot, and maybe you get a really nice activation with it with your main action, and you put a shop down, which gets you a warehouse action, and with that warehouse action, you now have enough money to pull off that trading house from your board, so that on the next turn, you can put a trading house down. Or if you can really link up a crazy combination, you can also use the foreign agents to do extra turns. And when you use the assistant placement actions to put assistants down, especially on locations where your opponents are without paying a penalty, you can then use foreign agents to activate those out from underneath them to get you ahead of the race. So you can do these things without having to wait for your opponents to vacate that spot. So when you're playing this game, there are going to be many times where you just need 1 or 2 bonuses here or there to get you where you need to go. And I found that usually everybody has about 1 turn where they actually do this into this, which lets them do that, and then they do this other thing, and they just have this really big turn, which is very satisfying to do, because you will also have turns where you just put 3 people down, grab 3T, and your turn is over entirely. So I love those big turns, and it's a really great puzzle figuring out how to get where you need to go by using the variety of of bonuses that are all over the place on the board when you're playing. For positive number 3, I just want to briefly discuss the flag system. I think it is really great how the game both incentivizes players to go wide with a variety of different flags, but also to try and get pairs of the same flag in order to grab the foreign agents. And you in particular want to get those pairs earlier in the game so that you can grab those foreign agents before they disappear, and they can be very important in the mid to late stages of the game in order to pull off the combos that you need to do everything you need, because you can activate 2 different spots on 1 turn, but more importantly, you can activate a spot that an opponent is on. So that can be really important to just grab those 2 silk that you need to do this other thing, and you can really work those foreign agents into the combos that I just talked about a little bit. But all the while, you are thinking about the flags that are on the orders that you are looking out to grab, and the flags that are on the technologies that you're hoping to grab, because you might be incentivized to grab a technology that you are not as interested in, but it's going to work really well with the number of flags that you have in front of you, and it's going to get you maybe 4 extra points. On the flip side, you might be disincentivized to take that technology that seems really good for you, but it's like your 4th British flag, and you know it's going to be worth no extra points. Maybe you take that other technology instead, which you don't want as much, but it has the right flag. Same with the orders. You will look to the resources that you have and the things that you can do out on the board, but you also look to the flags on those orders and make sure that they try and work well with the flags that you already have. Now, you're not going to lose the game if you mismanage your flags, but you can certainly get a ton of extra points by doing the flags correctly, and I think playing that right is a key to winning the game in general, and I think it's just a great little mechanism. All right, let's now jump into a couple neutral points, and the first of these relates to the technology cards that you can grab as you're playing the game. Now, I love it when you have technologies in games that let you bend or break rules, as well as incentivize different behaviors, and that is exactly what's going on here with the technology in Yokohama. But the reason this is a neutral point and not a positive one has to do with the cost for grabbing these technologies. Now, there is a pretty large disparity of interest between one technology to another. There are some that are not that interesting, like maybe just get a money every time you take a new technology, or perhaps get a couple extra points whenever you cash in an order. And these are good. I like that they incentivize the player to do those things now for the rest of the game. They help mold a strategy for that player. But there are also technologies that can come out that do drastic, gigantic things to the overall gameplay experience for that one player. They might be able to put 4 workers down instead of 3. Maybe when they pull their workers back, they now get to leave one out on the board. If they start their turn with no money, maybe they just get 2 free money, and another one lets them move their president onto a spot that somebody else's president is actually at. These are very humongous changes to the overall game state, much bigger deal than just get a money whenever you take a new technology card. And the issue that I see is that that card that gets you an extra money for the technology cards is like 3 or so gears, and that amazing ability that lets you put your president where somebody else is or put a bunch more workers out on the board is like 5 to 6 gears. So it's only twice the cost, but I feel like it's 4 times as interesting and impactful. So to me, I feel like maybe those lower cost, less interesting technologies should be even lower cost. Like instead of 3 gears, maybe 2 or even 1 gear, so you can really grab those easily in the right moment as just like an offshoot thing you want to do to maybe grab a flag that'll give you some points, and maybe you'll use that action once or twice versus the other really powerful ones that you're going to need to build towards. And when it comes to the cost for those, they are all about 5 or 6 gears, and I feel like some of them might be worth more gears than than others. And I'm not entirely sure if the gear cost to ability ratio is balanced throughout all these technologies. Now, this is not a negative point because I really am not sure. Like, if the technologies have played fine. I've really enjoyed using them every single time I played the game. It's something that I usually prioritize because I like how it will hone and mold your various strategies as you're playing. I just couldn't help shaking the feeling that some techs just seemed a little more expensive than they should be, and some maybe not as expensive as they maybe should have been. Neutral number 2 relates only to the 4-player experience, and I'll talk at greater length about player counts later on in the video, but for now I want to talk about the size of the board in a 4-player game. Now, the board scales with the player count. You have a pyramid with 2 players, and it becomes kind of a flat top pyramid with 3, and then you keep adding to the base with the 4-player game, so it's a really wide board. And I played 2 4-player games of Yokohama so far. And the first one I played with the standard board, and it was gigantic. And I won the game pretty soundly, and I didn't touch almost half of the board. I just kind of hung out in one part of the board. And part of this has to do with the random way that these tiles are going to come out. But also part of it was just the stuff was so far away on the other side of the board. It was just so big in the middle of the table. It was such a large commitment to move my president from here all the way over there that I never did. And I did really well with that game, and I didn't really like that was able to do so well by ignoring significant parts of the board. So I came up with a variant that I wanted to try, and I actually did try it as a 4-player game where I set the game up and I did a full pyramid with the 4 players. I just added an entire another line, and I took out the extra copper and silk activation spots. I also removed the canal, and I found that it played really well. I really enjoyed this one. It was a 4-player game. We were definitely getting in each other's way. It was a little bit tighter, but it wasn't too tight. And I found that I went from every single corner to every single corner on the board. It just tightened up the board a little bit so it wasn't so long and skinny, and it was more symmetrical. And I definitely preferred the way that played. But I'm not going to say that the way that it ships in the box is broken by any means. Like, many people have no problem with that. And that game I played, it was fine. It irked me a little bit. And I think in the future, if I play more 4-player games of this, I will most likely play my little variant instead of the one that comes in the rulebook. It's now time for us to go into a couple negative points. And the first of these is a bit of a 2-for-1 because I'll be discussing 2 different action locations that are out on the board and the problems that I have with them. So this is the church and Chinatown, and for both of these, the main high-level issue is that I don't feel like these are exciting destinations that you're going to want to go to fulfill the strategy that you're working towards. In general, it seems like you only go to the church and Chinatown as a consolation prize because you can't come up with anything else that you really want to do on this one particular turn. And well, I guess I'll go to the church and get a couple points and lose a couple resources. So let's talk about them separately. So with the church in particular, when you go to the church, you will lose an assistant to the board. You will gain some victory points and some assistant placement actions. And when you do this, you can discard some of your resources in order to increase the amount of points that you're going to get and the bonus that you're going to get for going on the board. The issue that I have with this is that it doesn't feel like the points that you get and the assistant placement actions that you get are worth it, are worth all that time that you're putting assistants down to get a big activation and to lose all of those resources that you're potentially losing. Because you can get assistant placement actions from fulfilling orders, as well as putting shops down out onto the board. And assistant placement actions are quite powerful, and I'm not saying that I've never seen anyone do anything cool with the church. I have seen it be pretty crucial in a specific moment here or there in plays to get those assistants down to then use a foreign agent to do a really big activation over there. You could do cool stuff with the church. It's just, in general, it maybe gets hit once or twice because it doesn't seem to be incentivized enough. And the main issue I have with it is that you can only give up 1 resource of each type when you do offerings. And I feel like if the church let you get rid of a bunch of a particular resource, it would have a new ability. It would be a destination for you to go to if you just had a lot of a resource. I ended a game once with like 10 tea left over, and I'm not saying that I played this well. Obviously, I didn't. I had all this tea I could not get rid of, and I really wish I could have gone to the church and at least gotten something more than 1 point per 3 resources at the end of the game. And I feel like I would have maybe made a point of doing a big church activation if at the higher levels I was able to do 2 or 3 of these particular resources, just to get rid of the stuff and have it be a new ability and option for you as you're playing the game. And then switching over to Chinatown, when you go to Chinatown, you can trade resources for money and vice versa. You can also buy imports. And it seems like the money that you get for the resources, it seems to correlate really well with the overall balance of the game, but it also seems like I'd rather just spend my turn and my assistance going to the tea plantation or going to the copper mine to just grab those resources that way. If you're going to Chinatown to get resources, you're probably on hard times because those spots may be blocked by other people, and I've never seen anybody be happy about going to Chinatown, let's put it that way. And I feel like it should be incentivized a little bit more, like maybe taking the lead from Concordia or something like that, where when you do a trading action, you get some money and then you could do some trades. So if the action, at the lowest activation gave you no money, but at like the 3 level gave you an extra buck, and at the 4 and 5 level gave you 2 or 3 extra dollars, as well as letting you trade around, it would be much more of a destination. And it's like, this is kind of like the bank, but not. I can go here, get a little bit of money, and get resources instead of just getting money from the bank, and it would be a destination and not a consolation prize. So I'm sure people might be watching this and saying, no, I played the game and I destroyed it once with the church. I used the church so much, the church is amazing. But from my perspective, I've never really seen it utilized much. In one game, a player really tried to go hard on the church. They put like 3 or 4 of their people down and they did well. But they only did this after they took a technology which gave them extra victory points for visiting the church. And they would have been, I think, dead last if they hadn't had that technology with that one particular strategy. So that pretty much wraps that up. I just wish the church and Chinatown were better incentivized to make players want to actually go to them more. For negative number 2, I want to briefly discuss how this game looks on the table and its impression on first-time players. The first time I saw a photo of this game on a table, I thought, wow, that looks like a cluttered mess. I am not interested in playing that game. It looks heavy and just like too much hard work. And I'm glad that I ended up getting a Kickstarter version of the game. I backed the Kickstarter. This is a deluxe version, and I will briefly say that I love the deluxe pawns, and I love the deluxe resources and the money and the coins and all that. That's all wonderful, but not everybody gets that. With the basic box, you just get cubes instead of the cutout assistants, and the resources are a lot less interesting to look at. And in both cases, you still have this really intimidating looking board that seems to tell new players that the game is more complicated and hard than it actually is. I'd say this is a medium weight game, maybe slightly on the heavy side of medium, but if you were to walk by a table and know nothing about this game and look down, you would assume that the people playing this game were in like a 4-hour heavy economic simulator or something, because there's just so much stuff and bits and pieces all over the table. And I did find that once I got a few turns into the first game, it did click, and I was able to figure out where I was supposed to go and how I was supposed to get there, and the icons really did work. I think the iconography is fine. It's just a bit of a soup of numbers and letters and colors and stuff, and that can be intimidating for pretty much everyone the first time they sit down to play this game. Let's now discuss the variability for Yokohama, and I think it is definitely above average. In fact, this is a strong selling point for the game in general because the variability is so strong. You have the action spots that are shuffled up every single time you play the game, and this will dictate how players are going to go heavy on one thing or another, because if you have a research station right in the middle of the board, odds are good players are going to take more technologies, and it'll be a technology heavy game than if the research station was way off on the side and it's got a couple, fisheries next to it that nobody really wants in that particular game. Maybe people don't research as much in that game versus the first one. Then on top of that, you shuffle up this deck of cards and deal those out on top of all the actions, and these are the bonuses you get for building buildings on top of these action spaces. So in one game, if you go to the bank, maybe you'll get a bunch of fish, and in another game, you'll go to the bank and it'll give you a warehouse action and a money or some points or something like that. And you are going to try and combo these together like I've talked about earlier, and it means that you might be more incentivized to go after that one spot and place buildings down there because it has the bonus that you really want. And then once you get buildings on that location, you're going to want to keep going back there because you can activate that spot better and better because the power will be more because of the buildings. And I'm not even done, because now there are these public achievements that will incentivize players to hoard different types of resources from one game to the next, and also maybe go after technologies or take those 5-point bonuses, and then also figure out the pattern of buildings that they want to put down onto the board itself. And then you also have the order in which you're going to pull out the order cards from that deck and the technology deck. I've seen games where people didn't really go for technology much, not because the technology was hard to get to, but because the technologies on the row were not really that interesting for them. But I've seen other games where like everybody has 3 or 4 technologies because of the location and the order in which those techs came out on the board. So as you can see, there are so many different ways that the game randomizes big decks of cards and pieces of cardboard so that when you sit down and play one game and you sit down to play it again, sure, the mechanics are the same, but the overall strategy that you're going to be going for is likely to be significantly different. Yokohama plays 2, 3, and 4 players, and I've played all of those different player counts, and I think it's good at all of them, but I think it's best at 3. And the biggest difference between the player counts has to do with the size of the board. In a 2-player game, the board is pretty small, and I found that it was not that hard to get where I needed to go. In general, maybe only 2 or 3 of the overall turns in the game did I have to put assistants down to specifically make a longer path to pull my president over, because everything was just so close to each other. The board was so tiny. Versus the 4-player game was gigantic, and when I played the base 4-player game, I found that I didn't even visit almost half of the board because it was so far away, it was too hard to get to. I just decided to kind of hang out in one area of the board, and I guess it made sense based off the way that the tiles randomly sorted themselves out in that game. I was able to do that, but I didn't like that part of the board almost felt off limits. It was prohibitively far away. And in fact, I talked about this in my neutral points already, that I have a variant where I removed the extra copper mine, silk mill, and the canal and made it a actual full pyramid for the 4-player game. And I like that much better. But in a 4-player game, you are going to have more downtime than a 3-player game because, well, you just have to wait for players to take their turns. And sometimes it goes really fast if a bunch of people have some relatively simple turns. And other times it might be a few minutes until it's your turn again if people are really chunking through some hard decisions. So I think all this combines together to say that the 3-player game is best. It has a good sized board. There's some good blocking going on. I like that. And I think that I would totally play it at 2 again. It's just a little bit more of an easy experience as you're not blocking each other that much and you can get to where you need to go. In conclusion, I've played Yokohama 5 times at this point, and I've really enjoyed all of those plays, and that has surprised me to a certain extent because I went into the game expecting to be lukewarm with it because it felt like it was a bit overly cluttered, and it also felt like it would probably be heavier than it ended up being. I remember when I first finished reading the rulebook after I got the game, I thought, huh, this is not actually that complex of a game. Sure, there is stuff all over the place. There's bonuses, there's boards, there's numbers and bits all over the place, but what you're actually doing is just placing a couple assistants, moving your president, activating the spot. The iconography is good. You can tell the power of the activation really easily. There aren't really any edge cases. Like you just teach a rule and you're like, it's just always like that. You go there, you count up the number of colored things you have on that spot, you get that much stuff. It's pretty straightforward. And I found that the clutter, you don't really see it once you find yourself partway through your first game. Almost like one of those magic eye posters where you focus your eyes just right and suddenly it kind of just pops out and you're like, oh, okay, I get it. I need to go here to go there. And once I go this, I can go over there and put my assistant here and there. It all just kind of comes together. And those are really wonderful decisions that you have figuring out the path you're going to take as well as where you're going to put these assistants down. I also love those bonuses that are scattered all over the board, and I will admit that this is probably part of the intimidation factor and the bit stew factor. When you look at the table, it's just so much stuff all over the place, and all of it matters. And the iconography is good, but it's kind of everywhere. And for new players, I found them oftentimes not really sure what to do with their first turn because there's so many different directions you can turn and go, and everything you do in this game gets you points, and pretty much all of the strategies that I've seen people go with have done well for them. But you do need to do everything to a decent amount. So like if you take a technology that will incentivize you for putting shops down on the board, well, you don't want to ignore your flags. You want to make sure that the flag, the different types that you have is going to work out really well for you for endgame points. There are just lots of different things that you're kind of trying to spin in your head, and I found all of them to be quite satisfying. So to sum it up, this game has surprised me. I've really enjoyed all the plays of it that I've had, and I'm looking forward to playing this one a bunch more. I don't know if it's going to hit the table like every single week, but it has just really great decisions, and it feels like this one honestly could be a bit of a classic. I don't see myself getting rid of this one for the long term. As always, I'd like to thank everyone who's been supporting this channel through Patreon, including all of these producer-level pledges. If you too would like to directly support the channel, you could do so at patreon.com/JonGetsGames, and I'd really appreciate it. Also, if you'd like to see more in-depth board game reviews like this one, as well as full game playthroughs and vlogs, please subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.